as it says, it is a vague title, and this is going to be somewhat of a sketchy slide deck, but it's serious content, so pay attention and try and think about how it applies to you. So what am I going to try and cover with you guys? Basically, I'm going to try and look at modules in JavaScript and how we currently try to do that and how we could be doing that, and the specifications that have been written at the moment for how we would do that. Script loading, some Requiredjs library, so a real-world use case or way that you could be doing it, and then the results of using that library and how you would optimize ready for production. There's a few things that I'm not going to try and cover off because it's a 15-minute presentation and it's writing JavaScript like 2012, not like 2015 when it finally comes out. And that's mainly the next sort of version of JavaScript's modules, ECMAScript Harmony. There's also a handful of other ways you could go about this instead of using the Requiredjs library. So I'm just going to write those there, but let you know that they won't be covered. And similarly, the different packers or minifiers you could use. A little bit cheeky of me to tell you all about it and then just ignore it. But it's for your own benefit to look at in your own time and make a decision of what library you should choose to use yourself. So a few different people have given you the lay of the land. And back in the day, everyone was writing some DHTML. You could get these really basic effects. You could change the scrolling text in the bottom of your browser. You could do all these things. Over time, we've added maturity, a lot of libraries, and those include jQuery, but also Backbone, Ember, and we've really pushed a lot of responsibility in our web stack onto JavaScript in the front end. We no longer just treat it as like a nice-to-have way to just zhuzh up the page a little bit with some effects and rollovers and stuff. It's actually got quite a lot of logic and responsibility residing in the front end. So with that, our JavaScript now is, we can't really just have that one big slab of JavaScript sitting in the header or that one external link to that one massive file that had everything, all your effects, etc. And we're starting to see teams, like front-end JavaScript development is serious now, so there's teams of people responsible to make that happen. And they're using a heap of different libraries all needing to work together in the page. And hopefully starting to think about modeling it like traditional developers might have with MVC concepts, some front-end view templates, etc. So we're starting to imagine that modular code is going to be a pretty good thing, right? It gives us a way to keep discrete chunks of code, work out what is related to another thing, and so we don't just have globals sitting everywhere, and we can have better structure. And what that allows us to do is just look at one chunk of code, work on it, provide the interface API for how that would look, and then how it would work in the global kind of bigger picture of your application, allowing us to test and do those things properly. But if we think about it, we get this feeling that writing modular JavaScript is the right idea and we should be doing it. But they kind of forgot to give us any way to really do it in JavaScript. There are no keywords like the other languages. Languages have import, require, they have include once, or all of those sorts of things. JavaScript just doesn't really have it. So as Mark alluded to with these ifs, that's what we're doing. We're splitting up code into files. We're using a function wrapper around it. We're doing some stuff privately scoped, and then we're exporting something to the global variable. And it's kind of a good approach. But the result of doing all of that is that we get a lot of script tags slowing down our page. Jared's sitting over there just cringing at the thought of this, I can tell. And hopefully a lot of you guys are too now. And on top of that, we have to somehow know in our HTML the order of our script tags, right? So you can see I haven't actually got the question asked here, but the answer to the question is pretty much your jQuery plugin wasn't working because you accidentally included your jQuery plugin before jQuery, and so jQuery was undefined. It seems like a no-brainer until you have a hell of a lot more modules sitting in your application, maybe a collection that uses a model that had a view that, what's the right order to put all those files? And you start to think to yourself, maybe HTML really shouldn't be responsible for knowing the dependencies of my JavaScript. Maybe JavaScript should. So this is probably a little bit of a tangent, but I feel, although Jared did cover it, I'll just quickly touch back on it again. When the browser encounters a script tag, it does halt the parsing of that page, and that's so that, again, as Jared mentioned, if it did anything to change the document or the CSS, that could happen properly without odd side effects, except for if you mention the keywords or the attributes of the tag async or defer, in which case async would mean that the script could load asynchronously and then execute asynchronously, and defer would defer the loading of that script until the end of the parse of the page. So those things can help, but it's good to keep in mind the effects of having the additional script tags as we progress through the rest of the slides. So one other slight tangent that I want you guys to think about is, as developers amongst us, what are the kind of things that you want when you're doing this? And pretty much there should be 3 or more. So get the app developed quickly and easily, right? That's kind of key. Be able to maintain that app quickly and easily as well is also pretty key. And for your users, make your web app quick to load and use. So it's pretty much boils down to quick and easy. That's what we all want. And you know, Ryan, being the lazy advocate that he is, he's happy with that. So the specifications that I mentioned at the start of the slide deck are Commonjs and AMD. So Commonjs was touched on by Jed earlier today with his NPM guide. And if you're familiar with Node, you'd kind of get an idea of how that worked. But basically, a group put together a proposal of how they thought that modules could work in JavaScript. I've got an example that you can see coming up, and it'll kind of touch on what Jed mentioned already. But basically, there's 2 key concepts. There is the exports concept, which you can see. So with Commonjs, there's only 1 module per file, and it kind of sandboxes the values in there in a private way. And the only thing that comes out of that module is the things that you attach to the exports object. So you can see, similar to the way that classes were being created before, we're kind of creating a to-do class with just the 1 function on it toggle, and then exporting that out. And then similarly, we are requiring that. So the other half of the Commonjs concept is the require function, in which we pass an ID, in this case models/to-do, and that's able to be resolved to the file, the to-do model declared before. Not really suitable for the browser at this stage. The Commonjs group wrote that specification really with the server side in mind, and kind of treated the browser as a second-class citizen, which is kind of unfortunate. They intended that in the future browsers would resolve that, and maybe kind of right now that server-side implementations would help to get browsers over the line. But the problems that they kind of knew about were the fact that you can't really synchronously require a file in the browser. The latency of that I/O just takes too long. In Node, you'll see that the code will evaluate line after line, and you'll require in a heap of things. They'll either come back hot from the cache, or you have to read the file, and the time involved is just trivial. But doing that in the browser is just impossible. Similarly, the browser doesn't currently have any concept of being able to sandbox an exports module, like Node does, for example, and there is no require function. So there's a couple of things that prevent us from using Commonjs quickly and easily right now. That's okay though, because we can use asynchronous modules to get around that if we know a couple of things up front. And basically what we need to know is, for the module that we're defining, what are its dependencies? And once we have all of those dependencies loaded, then we would pass those into a function so that they could be used. So again, this is the kind of thing that's a little bit easier to see in just a quick code snippet. But basically, if you look at this fairly contrived example, it doesn't actually really depend on jQuery or underscore. There's a function at the very start called define that's being used, and we pass in, I've ignored the fact that you can pass in a module name, but we pass in a collection of dependencies that the module we're declaring depends on. When those are all loaded, and they can load in parallel, but will be marshaled back in the correct order that you've depended upon them, they'll come into that factory function and be aliased as $ and underscore, the symbols. And that function will execute, creating a to-do, attaching the toggle function, and then exporting or returning that. So you can kind of imagine that we could do something very similar to using Commonjs, but by wrapping it in an AMD approach. So in this case, this is a little bit trickier as of what's going on, but we're choosing to ignore the array and instead just passing one single function and the parameters that we receive. This is happening through an implementation, but we can then use static analysis of the toString of that function prior to doing anything to realize that within that code, two things are required that would need to be loaded and marshaled into that factory function before they could be used. And then once that happens, it could continue to work basically as Commonjs does on the server side. So it would go through and detect that it needs require based on like the toString. So the idea of this is good in theory, but it breaks down a little bit in terms of compatibility. There's some obscure browsers out there that can't call toString of a function, like the PS3 or probably the Android that everyone was giving stick to yesterday. So that's kind of where things are at. Specs are hard, but fortunately, the guy behind Requiredjs has done a super job to make it really easy to start using modules in the browser right now. So Requiredjs is a JavaScript file and module loader that you can download off GitHub or the website. And basically, it allows you to load the specified dependencies and modules that your application has, including nested ones. So as I kind of said, if you had a couple of things that depend on other things that depend on other things, then that hierarchical tree will be traversed, and all of that will just be sorted out for you, and that the definitions will get the parameters in the right order. So if you were to start developing using it tomorrow, which I hope everyone goes home and starts doing something tomorrow, you would write your web app using modules like the code snippets of a couple of slides earlier, and you would download and include require into your HTML page and specify your main application model, kind of like your entry point. So what we have is a snippet now in your head that just looks like this. You can see that the source is the second attribute just pointing to a library. And the first attribute is a data attribute that's specifying the main module of our application. So under the hood, what's actually happening is Requiredjs creating a heap of script tags dynamically, and it's putting those into the head and letting them load up as well. So it basically gets to the same point that you would have had if you had have statically written all of your includes script tags yourself in the HTML, except for the fact that the concerns are in the right spot, as in JavaScript, not in the HTML or on the developer kind of knowing how to do that themselves. Which is cool because it means you can have an area of your web app like the FAQs page or the report a bug page, which no one ever goes to because your app's so awesome. So you just exclude a whole chunk of functionality in modules and only load those when that part of your site is ever hit up. So I'm going to switch out and try and show you what that looks like. You can see that there's a script included in this head. So I'm just using a to-do app that's by Adi Osmani that's basically used to compare to-do implementations of different frameworks. And I'm going to load that. I'm just serving that locally. So that's kind of what it looks like. If I show you the network tab or the head tab, you can kind of see similar sorts of things. All of those scripts are there when I inspect it. But if I view the page source directly, you still only see that one thing. When we switch to the network tab and reload the page, you can see they all loaded as well. So this is kind of what you would do in development It allows you to still debug nice and easy without source maps or anything crazy going on with compiled stuff. So you see all those different files that are involved in this application. Right, so another thing that Require does for you is allows you to use plugins. Two of those that I find are most interesting and important are one that allows you to just load a text file and then marshals that into a string. So you've got a file on your server that you would use for templating, for example. You can load that as a dependency of something like a view and then use that to insert HTML or update HTML in your page. Another one is the order plugin, and that allows you to specify that a certain dependency needs to be loaded before other ones can be loaded. And this is the sort of thing that springs to mind, say, for jQuery, where you need to ensure that your jQuery library has loaded prior to your jQuery plugin, for example. Otherwise, things can load in parallel and get out of order. So there are more. You can find them on your own. So here's a quick look. If you look at the third line, the start of, you can see that the text and then the exclamation mark is used to indicate that a plugin text is loading, and then a module name is just a template to do HTML. And so similarly, that is resolved and passed into the function and will just be that string of markup in there to use for your template. So the render is basically just using underscore, replacing the string of templating with some variables, and then assigning it back using jQuery on an element just with the HTML. Right, ready for production, modular code. Bum, bum. We need to start to consider the impact of all those script tags that I showed you loading through the network panel, because again, Jared will probably be screaming in his head. That's good. The Requiredjs library ships with a optimizer code that can be run using either Node or Rhino, and under the hood that's using Uglify. I've got an example build file that you can use, so you can either pass in command line params or you can just point a JavaScript object literal at it. So in this case, you can see that I'm trying to target the main module and output to main.min.js. And I've specified a couple of paths that the app uses. You notice that the jQuery one says empty. That's because in my application, I'm actually pointing to the jQuery CDN on the internet, so that I didn't have to have all that being served up my server. Then the last stuff is just inline text templates is true, so that those get compiled in there as well and can be served faster. So let's try and see if we can run that now. I've just got a terminal window up. So you can see, like, there's my JavaScript. It just currently has the main file. It has a couple of folders of other files. It doesn't have main.min.js, which you could see is not there. And then I can run this command. So if I'd paid more attention to Jed, I wouldn't have to write node modules Requiredjs bin. I would have probably installed it globally and had an easier time doing that. So maybe I'll do that tomorrow. And then the build has run. It started at main file, and it's discovered dependencies on a heap of other modules. It's found those, picked those up. You can see the templates are in there as well. They've been included. And now if we list our JavaScript directory, we see that we have an extra file, main.min.js, and it's got some stuff in there. So you can just trust me that all of that code just went in there. All right, don't trust me, that's fine. I'll change over the layout, and we'll just use .min. So I've just saved that. Now if I refresh this page, we should just see there's a single file there which has all of our stuff in it. And the file below that is jQuery being served off the CDN. Right, so we've just minified and merged our files, or concatenate. Last thing, again, Jared's probably still screaming because like Requiredjs is 8 kilobytes. We could shave that down a bit more. So Almond is a 800 bytes replacement, pretty much. It's just a little shim that allows us to load all of that built JavaScript, and it basically just results in like more or less an iffy kind of approach. It's like really lightweight. So there's things that you won't be able to do if you use Almond. I'm not going to go into the specifics of it, but you can check that out on GitHub as well. And I think I already talked about editing the layout and using the minified file, so that's kind of done and dusted. And if any of you are only just kind of tuning in and paying attention, now is the time to do it. Last slide incoming, and I'm going to now home some points that I want you to think about. You really should modularize your code for development and efficiency. It might seem like a little bit more effort to think about it up front and create more files and that sort of thing, but the maintenance benefits you get, the speed in which you can bring someone else up to speed, and all those things just is so worth it. The lack of complexity when you have to edit a file that's like only 100 to 200 lines is immensely worth it when you have to, instead of editing something that's like 4,000 million lines. Commonjs modules, perfect for Node, and in my opinion, AMD is the way to go for browser right now. There are some ways that you can kind of hacks to get Commonjs working for browser, but it's just not worth it. Make sure you're optimized before deploying. You really don't want to put your site out there with your amazingly modular code and have like 50 plus script tags being loaded. That would be, I feel like I would have done you an injustice if I didn't stress the point that you need to optimize your stuff. It's perfect with a low barrier to entry to be able to do your development without needing that additional step. But yeah, definitely make sure you do that before going to production. And if you're super keen, use Almond for that last extra 8 kilobytes if that's important to you. That's all. Thank you.